So, welcome to the Red Nation podcast. I am joined today by Ursula Casus as well as Professor David Correia. And we're going to be talking about this new book that just came out through Haymarket Press. It's called An Enemy Such as This, Larry Casuse and the Fight for Native Liberation in One Family on Two Continents Over 3 Centuries. And by the time this premieres, people should be able to buy this directly from the Haymarket website. And there's also a foreword by Melanie Yazzie. So I guess before we get into the book itself, this book is really about a family's history. And we are fortunate enough to be joined by Ursula Casus, who is the sister of Larry Casuse, who is the topic of who will be the topic of this conversation, also the one of the main protagonists in this book. And I wanted to first just have both of you introduce yourselves. We'll start with Ursula, if you want to just introduce yourself, where you're calling from.
Um, I'm Ursula Casuse Carrillo, and I'm in Gallup, New Mexico. I live here in Gallup. I made it my home. I'm here.
And David.
Yeah, hi, I'm David Correia. I'm a professor at the University of New Mexico. I live in Albuquerque right now.
Well, thanks for joining us. And before we get started, Ursula, I was wondering if you could maybe tell us who is Larry Casuse or who was Larry Casuse.
Um, Larry, and I'm speaking for myself, my brother. Um, to me, I see him, and I always have, being a little girl. When I was 12, he passed away when I was 12. But as a little girl, and as now, I've always seen him as kind of like a gentle giant. Larry was a very good man. He was real kind, smart, always reading. Larry, you'd never see Larry without a book. And then when he got into the activism part, he was always carrying a briefcase in. And to me, his kindness was he was more or less a protector because I was kind of a shy, picked on kid. And he not only protected me, but taught me how to defend myself and taught me a lot. By the time I started school when I was 5, and when I was 4, probably maybe even younger, because I remember a lot. I wrote cursive because Larry, always teaching me, and I found myself. The more I think about this, I always wait on Larry. Larry was like my comfort zone because there is so much trauma. You know, my parents never there, and different things happening that I look forward to Larry coming home. So, and it was always like that till the last time I seen him, which is the last Christmas of '72. And I remember waiting for him then. But that's what he was to me. Now, do you want to know about the community? Back then, as I said, I was young. I didn't know much. But as I got older and after this happened, I realized that Larry, uh, it just touched his heart. We're from I have there's 7 of us in this family, 7 children. My mom and dad. My mom is Austrian. My dad is Navajo, and we lived in Silver City. And when we moved to Gallup, I was, 7 years old. Larry must have been, I don't know, a teenager because he was his first year of high school. But we basically were raised with the Mexican people, and I don't think we really understood what we were. And when he got to Gallup, I think it touched Larry. My dad used to say this. Larry's heart got touched by seeing the Navajos on the street, the alcohol problem. And so that's where Larry started. He wanted to help them. And when he seen that there was a Navajo Inn, I'm going to give you some history of it. The Navajo Inn, it was, I think, 75 feet from the Navajo reservation. And this bar, I remember getting in Larry's briefcase. And I get in trouble for that. He'd tell me to stay out of there. But the pictures, he had a lot of Polaroids of the drunks just laying on in the dirt on the parking lot. And I mean, they'd be people like laying under the tire, and they'd get run over, and they wouldn't find him for a few days. They'd leave him there. Every night, people were getting run over. From David's book, I learned a lot. That. And by the way, David, it was great the way you portrayed all this. But people walking into that bar, just stepping over people passed out. It's just unbelievable. But that was happening. And the main thing was this bar was owned by 3 so-called pillars of the community. And one of them was Emmett Garcia, which was the mayor of Gallup. And he just got appointed board of regents to the UNM, I believe, and which was totally wrong. You know, he's owning this bar, and he's going to be making decisions for UNM, probably, important decisions. And if I believe he wanted to open a treatment center in Gallup, and so that's totally against. You want an alcohol treatment center, but you own this bar. It was just totally hypocritical. And Larry seen that, and all he wanted, where I thought until David's book, I thought he wanted to close the bar down, but I found out through David's research that he just wanted to move it. That makes it even worse. It wasn't like he was trying to take away their profit, but they just didn't listen to him. I remember seeing Larry on the news right before Christmas, and he was in Santa Fe talking talking about what was going on with Emmett Garcia, and they couldn't appoint him on the Board of Regents. And I remember they let him speak, and they just ignored him after that. It was like he wasn't even there. And so Larry, he I believe that he believed he had no other option. He wanted to get the attention. He wanted to help these people. And I really believe even if they were Navajo or not Navajo, if there was a bar like this, he would have wanted it closed. I mean, moved. Don't matter what nationality you are, he would have wanted to help these people. That was just Larry. He was kind and wanted to help. But so that's why this kind of turned into that situation where he didn't have a car. He was a student at UNM. This was 1973. And he kidnapped Dalbert Rudy, I believe, in Albuquerque to get a ride to Gallup. And that story was really interesting because I've always wondered about that last ride, what Larry said, what he did. I've always wanted to know. And David caught a lot of that. But and I've always known that he kind of changed his mind. I don't know where I heard that from, but that that Dalbert Rudy more or less believed what Larry was doing. He thought it was right. And for a Republican doing that, that's just like a miracle right there. But anyways, so Larry feeling, like nowhere to go. And I really don't know much about Robert, the guy he took with him. All I know is that he met him like 3 days before, or that's what I heard. I don't know if that's true or not. But he came with him, and they went to the mayor's office, and they're what they were going to do, they were going to show people they had nothing to be scared of with this man. And they were going to take him to a place. Some people say the Indian Center, which was 2 blocks away from where this mayor was in his office, or up to the mountains, just to hold him until they caught the people's attention, which they were going to get, no matter what this mayor said. But Larry, of course, he went in there. The chief of police was there, and I think a judge, and they immediately, he was caught. His plan wasn't going to work. And when he started going down towards the Indian Center, a train came because the Indian Center was right by where the trains are, and which is kind of crazy. But my mom, by the Indian Center, was the welfare office, and my mom was there this time. My mom was down there, and I think this was about 4 o'clock because I think this all happened at 4:30. But I don't know if this was planned either. But Larry went into a sporting goods store, and of course there's lots of guns there and stuff. But that's when the shootout happened, and from there, what I know and what I really believe is the mayor jumped through the front window to escape, and then they were surrendering. Larry was shot already once, I'm pretty sure, and but they were coming out. Robert came out, and when Larry was coming out, 2 cops went in, and Larry they killed him. Some say that when he was walking out, they shot him from the top of his head when he was coming out, but I believe more that they went in and killed him because they dragged him out. I've done some investigating by myself, and there's this banker. He told me that he was there, and he's the one that went with the mayor to the hospital. So he more or less seen Larry um, sitting there, and they pulled him out, dragged him out. And then it was just devastating because my sister Najani um, ran ran down when we found out when they called the house. Najani ran down there and covered up Larry because they were down there posing, taking pictures with him, and which is just awful. You know, a newspaper shouldn't do that. A newspaper should not be celebrating someone's death by putting their bloody body on the front page. And the cops also with their guns, their rifles, holding them all proud. Um, but it was just devastating. And from there, the community, a lot of people believed in what Larry was doing. Just the fact that he had the guts to do that, to stand up alone, which I believe took a lot, a lot. He was just a very brave, courageous man, and he would just wanted to help people. That's the bottom line. He wanted to save people's lives, and they weren't going to let him do it because they wanted to profit. And that's the story. And his legacy to me is he's a hero. I got stuck on that word martyr, and I still don't understand that yet. Um, but I know that Larry, to me, is just a hero. I like that word better because he and I miss him. I know if Larry lived, he'd probably be who knows, the Navajo Nation president. You know, he knew German. Larry was the only one out of all of us that knew the languages because my mom, I guess, didn't know English, but he knew German, and I remember him learning Navajo. You know, when I was little, you know, little words here and there, but just real smart and loved me. You know, after the divorce, my parents got divorced in '72, and from there, it kind of that was the last time us seven were all together at the courthouse when they got divorced. After that, I see Larry as being the glue to it, to the family, to the siblings. And when Larry died, we just kind of scattered. You know, it was over. But we all love him. I know that. That's all I could speak for them is I know they all love him, and he loved me. And sorry, I get off track sometimes, and I get kind of sad still.
No worries. Thanks so much for sharing that. Thanks so much for sharing that. I want to turn to David and let's talk about the book a little bit because I think Ursula gave a really important and kind of on the ground perspective of what led up to Larry Casuse's final act. And in this book, you look at sort of the longue durée of history, going back centuries and beginning, with scalp hunting, Apache scalp hunting, and maybe you can start a little bit about why you chose to do a long history this way and writing. It's not necessarily a biography of Larry Casuse as much as it is kind of a longer kind of unfolding history of border town violence, settler colonialism, resource extraction. So maybe you can kind of go through these various phases of the book and why you chose to write this kind of history this way.
Sure. Thanks for having us, Nick. Um, and it's really great to be on this with Ursula. Um, I've known Ursula since 2013. We met actually at the 40th anniversary commemoration that the Kiva Club put on at the University of New Mexico to celebrate Larry's life. And Ursula and her brothers and sisters were there, and I met her then. You were there too, Nick. Um, I this that's a good question because I'd never written a biography before. I'd never written a history or a story about someone whose family was alive, and I just felt so much responsibility to do that well. I feel like I had an obligation that for a long time I didn't know how to fill. I didn't want this to be some academic book in which I make some argument using Larry as an example or an illustration. I thought that his memory was worth more than that, and that his siblings were owed more than that. So, and at first I didn't what the story that Ursula just shared about the last day of Larry's death is a story that I talked to a lot of his friends and comrades over the years, and everyone always had a different story, and a lot of people didn't understand what had happened and why he made that choice to do what he did. I mean, he'd been organizing with a group called Indians Against Exploitation for years. He was the president of the Kiva Club, which is a Native American student group at UNM. So he was really, and so many people knew him so well as this committed political organizer and activist. And all of them were surprised. I mean, no one knew. He had never talked about this plan to do this. And so it was really just years of trying to figure out, like, why would he have done this? Like, what was it that motivated Larry on that day to do that? And I had to track down Delbert Rudy, the UNM student that he and Robert Nakadonai kidnapped on campus. It took me years to find him, and we talked, and then Ursula, I would just drive to Gallup, and I don't know how many times I visited Ursula, and I don't know, dozens, I would think. We spent a lot of time together. She was so generous with her time and telling me about her family. And I just realized that the family story is so remarkable. And the more I learned about Larry's family, Ursula's life, her sister Erica's life, I talked to Donald Casus, I realized that, there's no way to tell the story about Larry and just focus on the last year, a couple years of his life, because he was, as Ursula said, he was a really thoughtful young man, and he voraciously read, and so he understood his history, and he was really conflicted by it. I mean, as Ursula said, her mom is Austrian. Lillian Hutzler, they met when Lillian was preteen. Louis, their father, was in the war, and then after the war was an occupation soldier in Austria. They were born in Santa Rita, New Mexico, south of Albuquerque, near Silver City. Louis, their father, was a miner on one of the largest copper mines in the world. And I just started exploring, that history, and spent some time in archives in Texas and in southern New Mexico reading about, mostly were like Presidio records from the Janos Presidio in the 1820s and 1830s, which was the original establishment of this copper mine. And so I realized that, like, there's a much longer story to tell about this. And it provides, I think, a more important context for all the decisions that Larry made as an adult. And the only reason there's a Silver City, the only reason there's a mine, a copper mine, which you could see from space, I mean, it's an enormous mine. I mean, it's like 2 miles across and like 1,000 feet deep, is because of efforts in the 1820s through the 1840s by largely Mexico, but also these American mining speculators to, like, establish control over what was Apache homeland. And it was just this violent period in which Mexico, unable to really provide what they would consider frontier security, turned to mercenaries and created what's called the contratos de sangre, with these blood contracts in which they put they put a price on the head of every Apache man, woman, and child, and it just incentivized the murder of the Apache. And like, soldiers of fortune flooded into the region. And so the first major chapter of the book tells that history, and it sort of culminates with the assassination of an Apache leader named Juan Jose Compa, who up until his murder by this band of soldiers of fortune, all American mostly, had kind of somehow held together the Apache claim and control of this region. And after his murder, the copper mine really expanded commercially. And this would be where Larry would be born. And this would be where their father, Louis Casuse, would work. And so I wanted to tell the whole story of not just Larry's life in Gallup and the last day of his life when he was killed by police, but the whole family's story. And it took me to Europe, uh, telling the story of Lewis's military service, telling the story of Lily and their mother's early years growing up in occupied Austria, and her escape from just a destroyed, war torn region, and her arrival in Gallup, and the years living in Silver City when Lewis worked. So it's worked for Kennecott, the at the time is the largest mining operation in the United States, one of the largest in the world. And it's just a fascinating story, and I don't think there's any way to understand history without telling that story. Like it really explains, I think, so much of the context about this, the indigenous struggles against colonial conquest and colonial violence, and that's what Larry was doing. I mean, his whole adult life, as Ursula said, I mean, he was educated by other Navajo organizers and activists. Once he got to Gallup, he understood this history. He committed his life to confronting it and fighting against it. And so I thought the only way to tell the story is to tell the entire family story. So the book is really as much about Lewis and Lillian, Larry's parents, even further back, their parents and grandparents, and as you mentioned, Nick, the Ursula's childhood, and Erica, her sister, with Larry, and it ended up being, I guess, a kind of a history of colonial conquest in New Mexico through one family's story, and I couldn't imagine any other way to write the story. It seemed to me the only right way to do it, the only way to really honor his legacy and his memory, and to finally do it in a way that we could put to rest all of the efforts that people have for years in trying to dismiss Larry, and to ignore what he stood for, and what he did. So it was, and to be honest, I think for a long time I didn't think I could write it. I had to be a different kind of writer to write it, and it really was. I owe a lot to Ursula. I mean, in my acknowledgments, I think that anything good in this book is because of the sort of generosity of Ursula and her sister Erica, and the faith. This I don't know why she had faith that I could do this well, but it made all the difference for me. And I hope I was really nervous actually waiting for Ursula to read it. I really was. It was very nerve wracking to wait to hear from Ursula, and she did text me and said she liked it, and I could finally breathe easy. And it's a remarkable story. I mean, the very dramatic last day of his life is really, quite honestly, the least interesting thing about his life. Larry was really remarkable. His family story tells a story about our shared history that is never told, is just ignored, and it's, I think, crucially important to understand his life.
Yeah, and one thing I found interesting about your research on this, and you know, um, the mine that you're talking about is might be well known because of the film Salt of the Earth, and I think it's important to talk about, I think, Gallup is its own history. There was once a coal mine there. There's still mine shafts that go under the city, and also this copper mine in the south of New Mexico on near the border. It's kind of become this iconic place for a variety of reasons, as you explained, with Spanish conquest and sort of a Mexican interest in this particular region. But then also in the 1950s, you had labor strikes, organized labor. But one thing that's kind of erased from that film, Salt of the Earth, is sure we see the kind of Mexican American labor unions and the organizing that takes place. And in the film, they also show kind of the gender division of labor, men going to the mine, while women basically are relegated to the home. But one thing that isn't featured in that film is Navajo labor or indigenous labor, and the conditions that they face, and how Lewis and many Navajo men ended up and Navajo families ended up at that mine specifically. And can you talk a little bit about that history, because I think it's
Yeah, this is
important.
this. Ursula was born down there. I mean, she could tell us some of the stories about her childhood before they moved to Gallup. Um, the coal mine you mentioned, Gamerco's owned by the Gallup American Coal Company, was actually owned by Kennecott. It was a subsidiary of Kennecott. So at the beginning of World War II, when the draft took a lot of their Spanish-speaking workers away, Kennecott started recruiting Navajo miners. Basically, anyone who's worked at the coal mine, and they had that connection to Gallup. So they turned to Gamerico to start recruiting Navajo men, young men, to come down and to fill in as miners for men who had left. And the plan was always to it was temporary. They just wanted to bring them down. And the conditions that they lived under were brutal. I mean, they basically lived next to like the mill site, and where the tailings that were dumped. It was, as I write in the book, it was like camping next to a chemical fire. That was where they were forced to live. They were paid the lowest in the mine. The union that represented workers at that time has been made famous by the film Salt of the Earth, and there's plenty of books written about the mine, the union, the film, and the fact that there were hundreds and hundreds of Navajo miners working in that mine is usually never more than a footnote in any of those books. No one tells that story at all. The union really didn't defend their interests, weren't really interested in organizing Navajo men. Um, Lewis actually, along with one other man named Hayala Nez, were the only Navajo miners to ever join the union even. Lewis would go to union meetings. Hayala Nez was on a negotiation committee in the 1950s. The other men refused to because their interests were ignored by the union. The union actually, I mean, there were plenty of organizers with the union that tried to organize Navajo workers. There were plenty of individuals that tried to defend the interests of Navajo miners, but the union as a whole, as an institution, didn't really care. Didn't because the Navajo miners were paid so little and treated so poorly that they would often just last a paycheck and then go back to Gallup and just abandon it and somehow and for some reason Lewis stuck it out and worked there for years. Actually worked there until 1967, when there was almost a year-long strike, and they couldn't make it anymore. He couldn't live on strike pay, and then they moved to Gallup. So I spent time in the archives for the union, and there's a miner down in Bayard still that remembers Louis Casuse, and he actually pulled archives from the company out of the dump one time, and it had all the records of the Navajo hiring program, and he shared those with me. It's Terry Humble. And it's a really incredible story. I mean, that film Salt of the Earth, tells a really important and depicted as a pretty heroic struggle against capital by Mine Mill, which is the union, but glosses over the fact that none of that struggle defended the interests of Navajo workers. They weren't brought into the union in any way that they would have wanted to, because it didn't serve their interests. In fact, they wanted the company to stop hiring Navajo workers, in fact, and negotiated to do that. I didn't know that history before encountering those archives. I was just trying to track down Lewis's life and try to figure out what he did and where he worked and what years he was there. And really every step along the way, it was really remarkable, the things that Lewis went through and struggled. This is, Ursula grew up there, and there was just, have a Navajo father in Santa Rita and Bayard in the 1950s and 60s was to be an outcast, and they were treated as children as outcasts. And the Spanish-speaking kids didn't claim them, and the Anglo kids didn't claim them, and it was pretty rough childhood. I write as much as I can about that, particularly about Erica, her sister's experience down there, and Ursula's, and this is when Larry really, turned into a kind of a parent for them, and he would defend them physically against other kids, and was a parent and a teacher to them at the time. If it wasn't for Larry, I mean, I don't know how they could have survived that.
What I remember, I don't quite. I was young, so I don't remember a lot of the. I didn't know about the prejudices and stuff back then. I knew a lot of the hate. That's how I seen it. Um, but Larry, I remember Larry. The community liked Larry. Larry was an Eagle Scout, and that shows his leadership there. And I remember he did something for the church one time. We were always at church every Sunday as a family, and they had a big old thing for Larry at the church, and I don't know what it was. One of these days, I'll ask my oldest brother, my older brother Don, but we don't see each other too often. But I'll ask him someday. But it was just kids. We were always in the hills running around. We all hung together. They had to take care of me, and I was usually with my brothers, Larry and Donnie, had to drag me around, and Larry was always just carrying me around. He was good. I've never seen Larry be mean. Just protecting me, always protecting me. There's incidents I remember him protecting me. Just it's just like chasing people off, and he was just a good man. And it's just tragic. It really is, and it's in David's book brought a lot of attention to me and what my mom and dad went through. I didn't know all that stuff. I remember the mine, and the Apache stuff got kind of stuck a sword in me, because that's just really devastating. It's like that place is cursed or something. Um, but I always believed that my mom and dad owned that house, the first house. I didn't realize it until this David's research. It wasn't their house, and Navajo wasn't going to own a house, and I see all that now. I was kind of in denial about the whole thing because I thought I had such a great childhood. And the only reason that even comes close to it is because my brother's watching out for me. I remember falling into a gravel pit, and I was down there like all day, and Larry went and pulled me out. Who knows? If he wouldn't have found me, I would have been in there forever. But just a good guy. And then coming to Gallup, it kind of like, because that's when Larry got into his activism and seen it. I remember him being a football player, and Donnie, to my other brother too. But just always busy, just always concerned, and just good people. But that was David. Thank you so much for doing this for us, because it's been next year will be 50 years for Larry, and I've always wanted him to be noticed for what he did, for what he died for. And thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed becoming your friend.
Yeah, I mean the history of Gallup is very much at the heart of this book as well, and the history of border town violence. Something that David and I and other co-authors have talked quite a bit about and quite extensively about, and also just having done research on the Red Power movement. I mean, we often think of the Red Power movement as kind of arising from reservation experiences, which it did in many ways, but it was really the kind of off reservation experiences and the confrontations in places like border towns, where the Red Power movement really took hold. And in fact, in 1966, Clyde Warrior, who was a Ponca native, was the first to kind of coin the term or use the term Red Power in Gallup, New Mexico during a parade. And it kind of took off there, and it was the founding of the National Indian Youth Council, which also happened in Gallup, New Mexico. And the same goes in for the native movements in Canada. A lot of them really took off. Kind of the Red Power movement took off in what we know as border towns here in the States, and I don't know what they call them up north other than just white settlements. But I was wondering if we could, Ursula, if you wouldn't mind kind of describing, you live in Gallup right now, but if you wouldn't mind describing the kind of history of the town in terms of its relationship to specifically Navajo people, but also to Native people in general. Like it's a town of exploitation. It's one in which native people make up about half the town's population, but don't necessarily have that kind of representation in the political sphere. And as David pointed out earlier, with somebody like Emmett Garcia, you have this kind of Nuevo Mexicano or New Mexican, Hispanic or Chicano or Mexican American, families that aren't always, there's a lot of antagonisms with indigenous people as well as with the Anglo populations. And in a place like Gallup, it seems to center on the the city's alcohol industry specifically. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that in your experiences, having grown up there, but also living there currently.
It's I'll start from back there. After Larry passed away, I seen all that. It was really bad, and I remember all the bars downtown. It was bad, and I got picked on a lot after Larry died from the police and stuff. And so I became one of those people. Not they didn't just pick on me because I was native, which they always pick on native people. They picked on me because I was a Casus, and it was pretty brutal sometimes. Um, Terrible, but I dealt with all that. It made me a stronger person, and I kind of really got into the little movements here and there. Uh, Indians against exploitation. I really tried because I wanted to do something for Larry. And I more or less backed away from that when I got into having my own children because I didn't want them to go through it. And that's why that stopped. But today, basically, it's about the same. It's just more accepted. The alcoholism and stuff. They they uh they see it. That they just accept it. They did some good things. Like they used to make the Garden Deluxe. They made a profit out of it here, and they took that away. But a bad thing now that's going on, and it's kind of on the other side of it. But a lot of the bars closed down, I think at 10 or so, and there's only one package place opened. And I've always wondered those ones at the street people that drink, what are they drinking now? Because I remember seeing them drinking mouthwash and stuff, and so it's still pretty dangerous. And they're still judged. They're mistreated. Um, Lots of homelessness. I went through. I wanted to open a Indian center, which they need badly, but I'm kind of. I just don't got the time for that because I have my own business and stuff. But they do need that. The natives need a lot of help, and there is some places that help them, but they need a treatment center. They've always needed that. They need to do something with, like I mentioned. I could see getting rid of the alcohol at a certain time. But the thing is, they're going to go get it somewhere else if they don't got treatment. It's always going to be a problem. So it's just a mess here. It really is. And I'm one of the people that kind of just accepted it. I really did. But I'll help them. I'll do anything I can. And I don't close my eyes to it like most of the people do. There's still a lot of bar owners here that were back then. And same thing. They have the people lined up and they're right there feeding them. But then once they run out of money, they kick them out. It's all a profit. Gallup's a profit. I believe in that ceremonial being a profit. I believe they use the Indians for the jewelry stuff. They sell the fake jewelry. The motels, for ceremonial, they raise the prices. It's just a money town. If you want to become a millionaire, come to Gallup. And you could do it. It's devastating the way it is. I just it frustrates me, but I'm gonna stay here. It's my home. I'm not gonna run from it. I told myself when I was young, I'm not gonna run from it, and I've done that. I've dealt with the deaths and devastating things that have happened to me, and I'll keep on doing that. And I learned from it all. Became a strong person.
And David, can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on the kind of border town economy that exists in a place like Gallup, especially around this in the 70s, because it's the Gallup. I mean, Ursula mentioned the Gallup ceremonial, and that's kind of a key kind of flashpoint in this book. Talk a little bit about that and how it really is at the center. It's not just like a representational thing about Native people, sort of just performing their culture. There's, as Ursula said, it's like there's a profit motive here. And why is it so embedded in a place like Gallup?
Yeah, the Gallup intertribal ceremonial in the 1970s. I guess Ursula moved. You guys moved to Gallup. I think it was like '68, right? That
Hmm.
it was the largest tourist event in New Mexico at the time. Um, it was basically a chamber of commerce owned and run operation. Like all there was a board, and 11 of them were just like white Anglo business owners or Hispano business owners. And so when Larry got there, he started organizing with. Well, he actually joined a summer program put on by Southwestern Indian Development, and in the years earlier, they had done this study of the reservation economy, which we could talk a little bit about. But through them, he met a lot of organizers and political activists with a group called Indians Against Exploitation, which he joined. And that group, one of the key campaigns that it had been running for years was to shut down the Gallup Intertribal Ceremonial, because they were just commodifying Navajo ceremonies and traditions and you know and performing them for money in front of a white audience in a way that
Hmm.
was infuriated particularly the young Navajo activists. And so and that that was just sort of the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the whole town was really, Larry and his comrades called it the city of exploitation. There's almost no like economic activity in Gallup that wasn't designed to as extractive from Navajo people. I mean, in every possible way. I mean, like the town, all that profit was a profit based on the misery and suffering of Navajo people, whether they were trying to buy a
Hmm.
car, whether they were trying to, there was a whole pawn economy that was very duplicitous and brutal. The payday loans more recently, the alcohol industry, and the police were organized to just defend the interests of a commercial elite. Hundreds and hundreds of arrests. There was the largest drunk tank in the United States in the '70s. They had more arrests per month than any other city in the state of New Mexico. And I didn't do any comparison, but I couldn't imagine it would be larger than there would be any other place that were. I mean, 25 to 30,000 Navajo people were arrested each year, and that's just in the city of Gallup. And there were also the Navajo Police Department was arresting folks. Alcohol was illegal to possess or to consume on the Navajo Nation, and there was almost no place that Navajo folks could get a drink in Gallup that was safe, and so a lot of them would drink on the street. And so the only
Hmm.
legal place to drink was on the street where it was illegal. And so the sort of public nature of it was interpreted by Gallup, um, like non-native folks, as some sort of pathology around Navajo folks that took on a life of its own. And so the criminalization was intense. And there was no way around coming into Gallup if you lived on the Navajo Nation. If you didn't live in Gallup, you had to. If people were coming in to go to for healthcare services, if they were coming, to get a loan or to do shopping, in every sort of economic relationship they entered, they were being exploited. And so I try to carefully detail specifically what that was like in the '70s. A lot of that work we know is actually from Southwestern Indian Development. A lot of young Navajo organizers and like college students would come back to Gallup and spend the summer doing this research, and they were publishing that work. And it's a really remarkable body of work. I also talked to some of the lawyers with DNA, which was a free medical, a free legal clinic, and they would defend people every Monday. They were just their offices were full of people desperate for legal help, um, to find a daughter who'd gone missing, or to find a lawyer who would defend them against some car dealer had repossessed their car even though they had been paying all their loans all along, or some pawn dealer who refused to return their pawn. There was a story I learned about a man who given birth, and his wife had given birth in a hospital, and they said, "We need your insurance." He didn't know what they meant by insurance. He gave them his car insurance. When the baby was born, they said, "Well, you owe us all this money." He said, "Well, okay, I'll go." And he went back to the reservation, sold some of their sheep, came back, and they said, "Well, that just covers the time you were gone just now. So we'll waive this fee into a Mormon family fee if you let us adopt this baby." That's known as the Mormon adoption scheme. I mean, it was just this incredibly exploitive, extractive economy that didn't exist despite all the suffering that it caused Navajo people, but it existed because of the suffering it caused Navajo folks. And I mean, it's I have not spent obviously as much time in Gallup as Ursula has today, but I'm not surprised when she says it's just the same today. I mean, to say it's just the same today is to say it's this brutal, grinding, dehumanizing place for Native people.
It's more hidden now,
That's
though.
what that place is like.
It's hidden. Yeah, it's kind of hidden, like put under a rug, kind of, but you can still see it.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to Anglo folks in Gallup, and they had wonderful childhoods. They loved it. It's a great place for them. Um, it's when Larry was put on trial, and a couple times, his lawyer was like, "Look, Larry, you're Navajo, so they're never going to stop trying to put you in jail. It'll never end." That's just how the whole system was organized in Gallup then and now.
Yeah, there was an incident that happened after my parents divorced, and the us three smaller ones went to the reservation with my dad. We've never lived out there before, so it was all new to us. But Larry was with us. Larry was the only one that went with us of the older ones, and he'd go to his meetings in Gallup, the stuff that he was his activism stuff, which we didn't understand, and he left one night. And I remember that because we didn't want him to go. We were like in the car and weren't getting out, and but we finally did, and he didn't come home that night. And then about noon the next day, my mom brought him home, and he was crying. He went into his room, and he stayed in that room a lot crying. I remember. But what happened when he was coming home that night? Gamerco is a little town, probably like a suburb of Gallup, and now there's lights. There's a hill that goes up. There's lights, and you can see the road. But back then, it was just pitch black. And when he was driving home, there was a girl in the road, like waving for help, with a shirt or something, and he hit her. And it's kind of like one of those things. What do I do? Because do I leave her on the road, or do I take her to the hospital, or what do I do? So what he did, he threw her in the back seat, went up to Gamerco where the houses are, and tried to get help. Finally, he got help, and they took him to jail. And I've always thought about that, and that's probably what I would do, because I won't leave the person there. I'd want to help her. And since Larry was an activist and during these things, trying to fighting with the Navajo Inn people, they were trying to get him, saying that he killed her on purpose. And which is ridiculous. You're gonna tell someone to lay under the tire, and they're gonna, so it was wrong, and so that Larry went to court, I believe, a few days before his death, and I've learned a lot about that once again with Larry, with David's book, about the hung jury and stuff. I knew about it, but David got more into detail about it, and it's just it's like unforgiving. They were trying to get rid of him. They were trying to put him in jail to keep him quiet. And I had to bring that up because this relates to Larry too, his character. And I know his character, it really broke his heart.
Yeah, it's quite a sad story, and no doubt contributed to, I think, his motivation to end this very exploitative and what could be arguably called a genocidal economy around specifically the alcohol industry in a place like Gallup and across various border towns. throughout the United States. And I want to wrap up with just I think it's important to put into context, and Ursula did a really good job of explaining the events of that day, um, and what had happened. But I think it's also important to put into context that this final act of resistance on behalf of Larry Casuse to really um, dramatize, so to speak, the demands of not just Indians against exploitation, but the sincere demands of Navajo people, Zuni people who live in this town, and also indigenous people across the land. That this is an untenable situation that will continue, if not addressed, will continue to take Native lives. And this happened in the context of the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973. This was on March 4th, I believe, 1973. March 1st, sorry. The Wounded Knee occupation took place on on February 28th or 27th, the night of the 27th. It's also important to note too that, like, all across Navajo Nation, I've spoken to several Navajo activists at that time. Those who weren't at Wounded Knee, who hadn't gone to Wounded Knee, some of them were still in grade school, were organizing walkouts, in support of the American Indian movement, the Oglala Civil Rights Organization that were protesting Dick Wilson, but also protesting the U.S. federal government. So there was a lot going on. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It was part, and even Larry Casuse was honored, in many instances by the American Indian movement, by the activists who took over Wounded Knee, as somebody who gave his life during that movement, during that occupation, and he was honored as such, even by our people up north. So he is well known. But I was wondering, David, if you could walk us through that day, and Ursula pointed to this kind of speculation, I guess, or this assumption that the law enforcement had at the time that he had basically committed suicide. And I think it falls, how we have to basically be skeptical of these kind of police narratives, but also thinking about the police response, because he was under surveillance prior to prior to his death. So I was just wondering if you could walk us through that, Dave. Ursula gave us a great book breakdown, but if there's something that you found in your research, I know you detail it quite extensively in the book, but that pops out to you that you think helps explain not just his death, but the kind of the spirit of the time, so to
Well,
speak.
I mean, I hope that the book puts to rest once and for all the question about his death. He was killed by police. There's no doubt about that. He was killed by police while potentially still alive, executed. He in the store. I know because Robert Nakata and I passed away before I ever had a chance to really talk to him at length about that day. I only had a brief conversation with Robert Nakata and I in, I think, 2007, and then I think Robert passed away a couple years after that. But Robert gave an interview, which was recorded actually with Emmett Garcia, because Robert was incarcerated, he was facing life in prison, and had to accept the plea bargain, and the plea bargain included him speaking with Emmett Garcia. And in the interview, all Emmett Garcia wanted to do was to have Robert say that Larry killed himself, that Larry killed himself. And Robert said, I've spent, like months, and at this time, this interview happened probably like 6 months after. So this was in 1973. And Robert pointed out that we didn't even have a shotgun. And because the fatal shot was under his chin, which is part of the reason why some people have thought that he killed himself. But it was a shotgun blast. He'd been hit twice already by police gunfire. When they hold up in the sporting goods store, the police just unloaded a barrage of of fire. I mean, it lasted for minutes of just cops were reloading and just firing and then firing tear gas in there as well. And Robert like heroically just walked into a gunfire to try to stop the fire because he knew that Larry needed to be helped because he'd had two shots, one in his hip and one in his back. And so um, before Robert left the store, he got rid of all the weapons that they had in the store. The only weapon Larry had was a small pistol that would not have been able to produce the wound that the coroner said killed Larry. The owner of the sporting goods store, Ivan Stearns, said that they didn't even have ammunition or shells for any of the shotguns that he had in stock. So there were shotguns in the store, but even if Larry or Robert had tried to use them, they would not have been able to find any shells for those shotguns. When the police chief, when Robert came out asking for help, they arrested Robert. Manuel Gonzalez, the police chief, and one or two other, I forgot, I write it in the book, walk in, and one of them had a shotgun. One of the cops carried a shotgun in with him to the sporting goods store. And Robert Nakad has concluded that that's the only shotgun that had shells in it that could have been used, and that was consistent with the wound that the coroner said killed Larry. So there's no doubt that police, I mean, all the gunfire was from police coming into the store. And then, you know, they, as Ursula pointed out, they killed Larry, and then they dragged Larry's body out on the sidewalk. And then the police took turns taking pictures of themselves posing in front of Larry's body on the sidewalk, while the Gallup independent photographer took pictures of it. Najoni, Ursula's older sister, saw it happen, and she started screaming at the cops, and she grabbed a blanket she found in a car and covered his body. You know, that one of the photos, the Gallup Independent then ran all these photos in the newspaper the next day, including the pictures of Larry's body on the sidewalk. They didn't run the ones, though. Literally, the reporter, the photojournalist, I hesitate to even use the word photojournalist. I mean, they didn't run any of those photos. I mean, literally, of cops, like a trophy shot, standing, holding their gun, smiling, standing over Larry's body. One of those photos ended up spending, for years, was framed and above the bar at the Fraternal Order of Police bar. And Ursula spent, I think, until her early 20s trying to get him to take that down, and she succeeded. And so, you know, the idea that Larry killed himself is wrong. We know from the evidence that the police killed Larry. And also I know that Larry knew what he was getting into that day. I mean, he closed his bank account that morning. He and Robert went to the bank. He closed his bank account, took the last $63 he had to his name. And then, you know, explained to Delbert Rudy, who he kidnapped. And this is important. I mean, he kidnapped a student at gunpoint on the campus of the University of New Mexico. A man who at the time, who said to me, he's like, I didn't care at all about civil rights. He was this white kid. He's like, I didn't think that any of their claims were right. By the end of the 2-hour drive to Gallup, he agreed with everything Larry was about to do. He's like, Larry was thoughtful. He had tried everything. People were dying. And he was just trying to save one life by moving the bar even, just further from the road. But, you know, it seems like a modest effort, but he understood what the stakes were and what could happen to him. And as Robert said, he certainly did. And so I mean, I think that one of the things that this book does is sort of establish in a way that hasn't been established before that the police killed Larry Casuse and then celebrated it.
It's so strikingly similar to the assassination of Fred Hampton, you know, the chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panthers, that he was killed, I think, in 1969, and at basically raided his home. It was a pre-planned kind of assassination, but the circumstances of which are very similar. You know, incapacitated, basically shot while he was sleeping. He was drugged the night before. In this case, Larry Casuse was, wounded and completely defenseless in terms of being killed. But it's also, I think, a way to think about, this time period. I mean, Larry Casuse was killed. Two of the members of the American Indian movement at Wounded Knee were also killed by, federal police fire. No investigations into their deaths and their murders, essentially. No investigation into the killing of Larry Casuse, chalked up as self-inflicted gunshot wound. And so I think it's just like it fits the kind of the time period and what had happened. And I think I just want to give the final word to Ursula, and just ask you the question. It's like, how do you want people to remember your brother, and what do you think his legacy is?
Um, I want people to remember Larry as the kind man he was, and he was just trying to help people. He didn't want no one to get hurt, and he wasn't going to hurt anybody. I really believe that. He was just trying to scare them and get them to listen to him because they weren't. They weren't going to listen to him. And he did it the way he only knew how at the time. And I believe what David just said. He knew the outcome. Larry knew he probably wasn't going to make it out of there, but he should have made it out of there. He would. He took us with him, just about, in some sense. I'm still here, but he took half my heart. But thank you, thank you for having me, and David too. You guys, thank you very much. And I want to do anything to help Larry and to protect him. I always feel like I should protect him. I don't want someone saying something bad about him because he's a very good man. Was a very good man. And that's why I do show up to a lot of these things, because I want to make sure that he's seen for what he is. The legacy you're talking about is that kind man that just wanted to help the Navajo people at the time. He was finding himself. He was young. At 19, you're trying to find yourself. And I think that's what he was doing. And he found himself. And from all the tragedy he's seen, he just wanted to help them. And I wish I could do more, to help them now, but it's like I don't know, Gallup's a trip. But I know Larry's always with me. He protects me. Very good man. But that's his legacy. A good man that deserves all the credit of the hero he is, giving his life to help people, and having very courageous man.
Well, thank you both for joining us on this podcast, and just to kind of give a personal perspective. That day in 2013, I believe it was, when we went to the Larry Casuse Memorial, was the first time I heard about Larry Casuse, and it was organized by then Kiva Club president Leona Morgan, who really did a lot of work in, I would say, like, in honoring his legacy and also bringing back Kiva Club. And I still have the pamphlet of the news articles that she helped assemble that day, and it definitely influenced and inspired, one of the main inspirations for the Red Nation. And in fact, we've named our home office in Albuquerque the Larry Casuse Freedom Center in honor of him and his legacy, because we do feel like we are trying to continue his legacy and the work that we do specifically around addressing border town violence, but also just raising the consciousness of not just Native people, but all people, and providing a sense of dignity amongst Indigenous people who find themselves in these circumstances, whether it's in Albuquerque, Minneapolis, or wherever they find themselves, in these white-dominated border towns. That there is a long history of resistance. There's a tradition of resistance, and for those of you who are interested in the book, again, the book's title is "An Enemy Such as This: Larry Casuse and the Fight for Native Liberation in One Family on Two Continents Over 3 Centuries, just out from Haymarket Press. You can pick it up there. We'll put a link in the show notes. And I just want to say thank you to both Ursula and David for joining us on this podcast. And if there's any, organizations or links that you have that you want to share with us before we close out the program.
Oh, I'm good. I'm just really kind of ecstatic that you guys are giving Larry the what he deserves. He deserves a lot of being noticed, and thank you for that. I've waited and tried for years. He's finally, being recognized for what he is. Thank you.
I don't know when this is coming out, Nick. I mean, we have some events for the book. One at the Larry Casuse Freedom Center on I guess the 29th of April, and then we'll be in Gallup on Saturday, the 30th. And Ursula will be the one in Gallup, and her sister Erica will be at the event in Albuquerque at the Larry Casuse Freedom Center. And the Kiva Club is the book launches on Monday, April 26th, and the first event is with the Kiva Club. And Larry was the president of the Kiva Club at the time. Police killed him, and Ursula and Erica will be there as other members of the Casus family. And I'm just really pleased and so happy that first event is going to be a Kiva Club event.